Cornerstone, a podcast leading new thinking for the built environment.
It seems that we're finally at a point where, in general society, we have a pretty good understanding of why we are where we are and what we have to do to correct climate change. It's safe to say also we've sorted out the what is causing the climate issue. The real question for us now is how. We've all heard the promises made at COP26, phasing down unabated coal power, ending inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, ending deforestation by 2030, and nearly 200 countries rallied together, committing to a more sustainable future. If COP26 has told us anything, it's that we now need to move from targets to action plans, and we need to ask the question, how is construction going to deliver the net zero dream? No doubt a lot of people want answers on what the conference means for the future of construction, and what should our role be anyway for influencing change. To answer that question, let me just say welcome to our Cornerstone podcast. I am Richard Steer, Chairman of Gleeds, and I'm joined today by Simon Pringle and Simon Armstrong. Simon Pringle, would you like to say a few words about yourself?
Well, yeah, thank you very much. So my name's Simon Pringle. I've worked in energy, environment, sustainability for nearly 25 years now. My day job is I run a small specialist consultancy firm, and I'm also a professor at Edinburgh Business School in Sustainability and Innovation, and I am an Associate Fellow of Chatham House, which is the Royal Institute of International Affairs.
Great. And Simon Armstrong, welcome, and would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you, Richard. Simon Armstrong. I'm Director of Development from Grosvenor. I look after a major mixed-use development here in London called South Moulton Triangle, where Gleeds are the cost managers, I'm pleased to say. That's a 2-acre site right next to Bond Street Station that will include 200,000 square feet of offices and supporting retail accommodation.
Great, thank you, Simon. And I suppose I should just say, from Gleeds' point of view, that myself and about a dozen other people from the organisation visited COP26. We had a film being shown on our adaptive project across Peru, government-to-government venture, and we also had a presentation of part of that film in 3 dimensions in the green zone. We found the event very useful and very good, and brings a focus of attention to both the general public and to the governments on the work there. Simon Pringle, how did COP26 play out?
I think overall the balanced view is that we have come an awfully long way since Paris, since 2015, and as you succinctly said in the introduction there, focusing now on the how, beginning the conversation on the practicalities of what we actually do, rather than arguing about the extent of the issue. Really important for state actors. It's easy to forget that COP is an international negotiation. It's a UN event, and bringing these independent sort of political entities together and trying to get an agreement despite self-interests is a challenge. So we've come an awfully long way. So reasons to be encouraged by that. Reasons to be encouraged to some degree about the nature of the Glasgow commitment, even though obviously disappointments around watering down the language on coal, and a recognition that we've got a trajectory, even if we deliver on all of the national commitments, of around 2.7 degrees C. Now we know what a 1.1 degree heated world looks like because we're in it right now. We know what that can look like in terms of intense weather and other challenges. What a 2.7 degree world looks like is a terrifying thought. We need to bring global carbon down by 45% over the next 8 years. So that's really very sobering as a thought. The positives again from COP included a real focus on finance, because mobilising both public and private finance is going to be absolutely critical, and of course some specific agreements, but an increased focus on the role of corporates and the importance of science-based targets and carbon budgeting so that everybody's moving in that same direction. I think we can look to that as well. And hopefully that will be a springboard for more earnest action in COP27 in Egypt.
Now, Simon Armstrong, it's all very well having groups of politicians making promises and telling us the future's going to be bright and rosy, but at the actual, I shouldn't use the phrase coalface, but at the actual coalface, businesses have to operate, they have to be profitable, but they also have to play their part in combating climate change. I'm very aware that you've got some projects that are working very hard to be, because the issue isn't only net zero carbon, it's net zero embedded carbon within the construction process, and our industry is responsible for 40% of carbon production. So how, as a business, are Grosvenor going about making their contribution to battling climate change?
Thank you, Richard. One of the interesting things that came out of COP for us was that 40% of global assets are now covered by the target for 1.5 degrees. So that means that a lot of the property that we manage and our peer groups manage are covered by the same target. So we have to respond to this challenge. I'm very lucky to look after a major mixed-use development here in the centre of London, working with Gleeds. So in connection with embodied carbon, we are looking at a lot of reuse and recycling of materials in line with the circular economy. We've got an initiative that was tabled at the COP26 conference around Steel Zero, and that's a prototype project that we're looking to see if we can introduce green steel into the project to drive our carbon footprint lower. And then we're also looking at SEM3, which again is a sort of green concrete, if you like, to try and drive those carbon numbers down on the embodied side as well as the operational side.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Could you just tell us a fraction about the recycling steel, the green steel, how in practical terms it works?
Well, I think there's a number of different elements to it, but very simply, one of the keys to driving the carbon footprint from steel is to try and buy what we might call off-the-shelf steel rather than bespoke steel. So if we're buying special bespoke steel, then the carbon content of that steel is much greater than if we just buy an off-the-shelf product. Equally, some of the larger suppliers, such as Mattel, are working very hard within their own industry to try and identify green steel products, and we're engaged with that supply chain to try and understand what they might be working on or experimenting with, to see if by the time we're ready to go onto site in 2023, those products are available and ready to be used in practice.
No, that's good. So really the approach Grosvenor has taken is self-motivated. And I would now go across to Simon Pringle and say, do you think Westminster City Council or governments in general are doing enough to support businesses in their progress to combating climate change?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think looking at the scale of the challenge and what we were talking about before, and the 40% that's represented by built environment and infrastructure, I think it's the World Green Building Council looking forwards is projecting over the next 40 years or so over 200 billion additional square metres of constructed space, and that's just colossal. That's the equivalent, I think they were describing it as adding a city around the size of central Paris or central Amsterdam pretty much every week to the global footprint. So the implications of getting it right or wrong couldn't be more stark, could they? To answer your question, do I think they're doing enough? No, I don't think they are doing enough. I think the potential for government at all scales to show leadership in their own estate is there, and real leadership seems not to be coming so much from the public sector at the moment. There's a lot of catch-up going on to organisations like Grosvenor and others that have been very progressive on this agenda for a long time. So, and looking also at enabling legislation. So rather than doing things that are prohibitive or restrictive, reflecting back onto carbon pricing, for example, and actually creating a different economic impetus. We saw what happens when good quality regulation goes in around the waste agenda back in the late 90s and early 2000s, where the landfill tax came in the UK, and it's a very UK context, but landfill tax came in. And of course, what did we see? Well, we saw howls of protest from parts of the industry, but the industry responded to that very entrepreneurially, very creatively, and just created a totally different market response to resource management and waste. And we need the same type of activity and entrepreneurship to address carbon. And the only way we're going to get that is if we've got some really nicely defined level playing field type rules that operate not just across the UK, that would be a great start, but ideally globally, but certainly in terms of global regions.
Well, one of the problems with the global issue is we've got an increasing global population, and we've got migration of people from rural areas into towns, and we've got a migration that will start being forced by global warming due to lack of water, droughts, or destructive weather issues. So those go to compound a problem that is pretty bad at the moment, don't they?
Well, they do, absolutely. I mean, I think what you've put your finger on there really is a social feedback loop. So we hear a little bit about climate loops and sort of natural feedback loops, but there are socioeconomic or demographic ones as well. And as the impacts of a warming Earth hit what we refer to as climate vulnerable regions, right? Generally speaking, they're not the ones that are emitting the carbon. So we have this this horrible contradiction where the problem is sourced in an area that's less vulnerable, and the vulnerabilities are felt elsewhere, hence why the negotiations around loss and damage and adaptation, funding adaptation up in Glasgow are so challenging because there is an inequity there, and it is a feedback loop. So the pressure will just build as the challenge gets stronger, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
So,
no, we're finding that on our project in Peru, where we're doing an adaptation project against a future El Nino, and it's a government-to-government initiative, and it's working very well. But there's lots of other emerging economies around the world who will need this government support. And I think the image of the president of one of these atoll islands standing in the water, where he said, well, that was a beach 5 years ago, and you can just see it increasing. So I think that's really difficult. Simon Armstrong, how are your stakeholders responding to your very, very worthy initiative?
Very positively, and again, going back to COP26, one of the things that my colleagues observed when they came back is that many more voices turned up at COP26 with an attitude towards improving the response to the climate crisis, and that included quite a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises. And carbon footprint, I think I'm right in saying that our carbon footprint is generated directly to the tune of about 6% ourselves, whereas the remaining 94% is driven by our supply chain. So that means that if we want to drive our carbon footprint down, we have to encourage our supply chain to drive its carbon footprint down.
You'll have to forgive the next question because it comes from my quantity surveying background, but does it cost you more to build buildings in the manner that you're trying on the South Molton Triangle, or is it a very similar price level?
No, it is undoubtedly there is a cost, and certainly within the cost plan on the project that I'm managing, there is a premium for the sustainability requirements. But I suppose where we have to try and move the discourse is from a conversation around what's the cost versus what's the loss of value.
Yeah.
So if we were to create a development that doesn't incorporate all the sustainability requirements, then it might be obsolete by the time that we deliver it in 5 years' time. And that would impact the rental value and the capital value, and so we would see a hit on the value, even though we save a little bit of money on the cost. So, and this is the question that I think all property owners need to sort of ask themselves: is yes, there's a cost to a premium cost associated with new developments, but there's also a cost associated with retrofitting their existing estates and assets. But to what extent is that increased cost offset against the potential risk to in future diminution in value if you don't invest? And so I think by necessity people will need to step up and stomach that additional cost to avoid having an obsolete product in the future.
And do you find tenants willing to pay a bit premium on their rentals to get these type of properties?
Well, we're beginning to see, and going back to what was one of the positives out of COP26, and in prelude to this conversation, obviously we talked about the awareness point for the general population rather than for just us as practitioners in property development. And what we're seeing is that because all companies, whatever flavour they might be, have got environmental, sustainability, governance targets that they need to adhere to, we're finding that when people come and look at our properties, they're almost dismissing the ones that don't achieve those goals. So sometimes prepared to pay a premium for the ones that do. So there is an economic benefit as well.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing similar behaviours through lots of different sectors as well, aren't we? Where there's a penalty as they apply to that which doesn't achieve the stated goals, rather than an uplift on those that do.
I was going to ask you to what extent legislation needs to play a role in this, particularly bearing in mind that politicians tend to have far shorter horizons than the good folk at Grosvenor.
Yeah, sure. Well, we touched a little bit on legislation before, didn't we, in terms of creating conditions where entrepreneurs and businesses can operate within clearly defined lines. I think in that context it's important. But it's really easy to get distracted by the apparent need for regulation and legislation, and to sit back and wait for that to somehow happen and fix the situation. I think we think about regulatory drivers, and there are some. As and when we get a proper carbon price put in place, as and when carbon markets start functioning, and things get priced in from a budgetary point of view alongside the financial budget, that will have a substantial bearing across multiple sectors. But I think of more influence on non-regulatory drivers. And by non-regulatory drivers, I mean things that are either related to brand and reputation, to transparency, to the integrity of brands, and whether that's in real estate or it could be, food, agriculture, whatever it might be. And Simon was touching on the impact of the scope 3 of the supply chain, the influence of the organisation at the top of that supply chain is a really powerful non-regulatory driver. The ability of an organisation, whether it's public or private sector, frankly, to say, we've made a commitment, we've made a promise, and you're going to go and keep that promise for us. And we'll help you keep the promise by educating you if we need, or providing tools if we can. But if you don't help us keep the promise, we'll go find somebody to work with who will. Now that is a pretty compelling argument if you're sitting in a value chain. It's almost I don't really care whether you believe in this or not. We do, and if you want to be part of our projects, you're going to help us deliver on the targets that we've got. So I'd suggest that combination of downward pressure and encouragement, so it's not necessarily always a negative, encouragement as well, combined with the piece around brand reputation, transparency, brand equity, really key. And if you look at the relative value that sits across, so it's an American statistic, I think, across the portfolio of the biggest businesses in the States, the S&P index, they moved from having about 75% of it being tangible value in the late 1970s, real estate and trucks and goods and things like this, about 25% intangible, to the almost exact reverse, 85-15% was the last stat that I saw, i.e. the vast majority of value in large organisations is intangible. It's around brand, it's around designs, it's around reputations, and that can be destroyed really quite quickly. And the agenda that we've got at the moment to address the urgency around that means that it's out of enlightened corporate self-interest to be getting on with this and to show some true leadership where that may remain absent from a governmental point of view.
That's very good. We are.
Can I just make a comment on marketing and the importance of branding? And again, it kind of loops back to COP26 and the importance of it for the general population, because hopefully out of COP26, the general population are now attuned with the agenda. And they have the ultimate buying power. So, for example, when we all buy our financial services products, we now start to say, well, we're only going to invest with institutions who invest in sustainable or green products. Then inevitably those institutions are going to reinvest that money into, in my case, the corporate real estate sector, but only where those buildings that we create have got these credentials at their very heart. So lots of people will have different views on the importance of COP26, but I think for the general population's point of view, that awareness and that building that requirement to buy green products will filter all the way through everything that we do, because financial institutions are massive investors in real estate.
I think that's a very good point. We're in the present day seeing huge advances in technology. Slightly tongue-in-cheek, will technology save us? And Simon Armstrong, I know your role isn't purely construction, but the construction industry is renowned for being very slow to move and change and adapt. Technology is coming in, artificial intelligence, the greater computing powers that's available to people. Do you think technology within the construction, our industry, will improve our performance?
For sure. The industry now is looking at whole life monitoring. We're looking at performance on a longer term basis. BIM is now becoming more and more familiar as part of those processes. And particularly when we start to think of recycling buildings and thinking about material passports and the provenance of the materials that they came from. So those kind of things, those details don't exist for buildings that we're working on, that we've inherited, that we're working on now, but the buildings that we create for the future will hopefully have all those details stored as a result of the technology that we're able to use now to collect all that information. So I think undoubtedly technology will play its part, and you're right, the construction industry is quite slow, but we're learning from other industries.
One of the things we've not reflected on from a technology or digitalisation point of view, and this is to avoid me always being in the role of Cassandra here and coming out with all the negatives, but it's around the way in which we've been enabled to change our working patterns and our living patterns as well. And if we're going to take any encouragement from the pandemic months that we've all been living through, it's the ability of lots of organisations to pivot their business model really very quickly because they had to. And the rapid adoption of technologies which were there beforehand, but frankly were not being used in a universal fashion, whether it's Teams or Zoom, probably hated by many people now, but any other ways of doing collaborative remote working, travelling in different ways and so on. We've done that really, really quickly because we were forced into that corner. And that's taken away, for me, the argument that says it's too hard to adapt business models to a climate urgency. That argument's not valid anymore because we've just shown we can do it. We've done it for a different reason, but we can do it. And that will play through into the way that people no doubt use the spaces that you create and want to use those spaces in the future. So as your spaces are innovated, presumably the way people use them will also be enabled by technology as well.
So, Simon Pringle, this move towards decarbonisation is obviously going to create lots of new and different employment opportunities,
yes,
and we will lose some of the old employment opportunities. So what do you think a green job looks like in the future?
Well, yeah. So in this, I'm reminded actually of the comment that Simon was making earlier about the way that people's expectations of buildings change, and the question of what does a green building look like in 10 years' time. The answer to that question is a building, isn't it? And what does a green job look like? Well, it looks like a normal job. It's just the way in which our expectations are changing. I think there's a tendency at the moment, and you look at the regional action plan, looking at the jobs and skills, the apprenticeships, really trying to understand that, as you rightly said, as we decarbonise our economies, certain sectors will go, but the skills that people in those sectors have got are most likely going to be repurposed and reorientated. But actually, existing skill sets, such as ones when you think about Gleeds, for example, is a programme manager, is a project manager, is a surveyor, is that a green job? Well, it depends what the person's doing with that skill set, doesn't it? And if what that person's doing is enabling and supporting the delivery of infrastructure that's going to have a really significant impact on us nationally staying within our carbon budget, then that's a green job. Even though they're not, engineering a wind turbine or doing something in bioscience, it's still a green job. So a lot of the thinking should be around what is the intentional outcome of that work, rather than what they specifically do on a day-to-day basis. So my take on that one.
No, I agree with that, and that means, Simon Armstrong, you're already doing a green job, but how in the more general world, how do you think green jobs will look?
Well, I think just to pick up your point about Grosvenor first, I think we would say that everybody who works at Grosvenor has a green job, because sustainability is so intrinsic to our vision going forward. So everybody from myself as a development manager through to people working in finance or rent collection, whatever it may be, then everybody's doing a green job, and everybody's encouraged through our innovation policies and things like that. Everybody's encouraged to come forward with their ideas where they think we might be able to improve.
Yeah. So the whole issue of delivery becomes key, doesn't it? If we're focusing on how, we can't talk our way out of the situation. We can't write more reports about it. We can't set more targets until we've actually worked out how we're actually going to make change happen in a practical sense. And one of the things I was interested in ahead of this conversation was to think about how an organisation like Gleeds, or Gleeds specifically, can essentially represent a vehicle for delivery against some of these commitments that we know are embedded into the real estate construction, but need a delivery partner to work through. Is that something that you've reflected on as well? I imagine it probably has when you were up in COP.
Yes, and it's a very important part of our service delivery, is getting the concept of, however we wish to describe it, sustainability, climate change, actually embedded into our services, so they become an everyday working part of it, an awareness. We across the strategic advisory, the programme management, the measurement of the metrics, we need to be able to measure the effect so that we know whether this particular building is more green than the previous one. I think it's encouraging clients to think about sustainability and green issues in the early stages of the projects, to make sure that's carried through, and working and supporting with organisations like Grosvenor, who are obviously very aware and very upfront. And during that experience, we learn from it as well, and we can take that experience onto other clients and other projects. But it has to become part of the everyday working life.
Yeah, and I guess now that the concept of science-based target setting is much more broadly understood, and one of the outcomes from COP as well, not the non-governmental one, was the I think they're referring to it as the framework, but the science-based target initiatives framework, the corporate framework. So there is some standardisation, which was always a challenge in the past. It's going to put even more focus on the metric side of things, isn't it, to actually make sure that the integrity is there, and we're not opening up an integrity gap between the claims and the delivery. I mean, does that accord with your worldview as well, Simon?
No, I agree that embedding in the business is hugely important, but also, to embed, you need strategic leadership at the top of the organisation to say this is what we're going to do, and it's going to be non-negotiable. We're going to do it. You then need obviously processes to facilitate that, and so part of our decision making on projects is now what are we delivering in terms of financial performance, but also sustainability performance, and then also social value as well, which is very much a key part of Grosvenor's strategy. There's then training and education, because as we've said during the course of this conversation, so when I started off, sustainability wasn't something we talked about, so I've got no real knowledge from my time being trained in this area. So Grosvenor has provided that, and obviously you've got to be a willing participant as well, not only in terms of the technical analysis of this subject, but also the processes that we've introduced. So a combination of all those things leads to things being embedded into the organisation and becoming just part of day-to-day work at Grosvenor.
Thank you, Simon Pringle. Thank you, Simon Armstrong. for joining me today for what I found a very fascinating discussion, and I hope everybody who's been listening has enjoyed it as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.